So I'm going to transition now to welcome you to the keynote talk for our final day of Transcreation. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Eduardo Ledesma today, and I will read his bio. So Eduardo Ledesma is Associate Professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He received his PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures from Harvard University in 2012 and his BS in Civil Engineering from UIUC in 1995. He is the author of Radical Poetry, Aesthetics, Politics, Technology, and the Ibero-American Avant-Garde, 1900 to 2015, supported by a Fulbright research grant. In that book, Ledesma studies visual, concrete, kinetic, and digital poetry to understand the relationship between poetry and technology. He is currently completing a second monograph entitled Cinemas of Marginality, Experimental Avant-Garde and Documentary Film in Ibero-America, currently under contract with SUNY. And his latest book project, Blind Cinema, which studies films by blind filmmakers, has been awarded an NEH, or National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. So I believe, hopefully, we're going to have a few minutes for questions at the end of the chat. I'll ask my colleague at McGill, Dr. Cecily Rayner, to moderate the Q&A after the talk. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat in any language, and we'll do our best to make sure Eduardo has time to answer them. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Eduardo Ledesma for his talk today titled The Digital Afterlife of Augusto de Campos's Kinetic Poems. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate, so much for your introduction. Can you hear me? I am going to go ahead and share screen. Okay. Let me see here. Okay, screen share. Here we go. Okay, and hopefully everybody can see that and hear me. If not, I'm sure you will let me know. So thank you, Cecily and Kate, for inviting me, and Alexandra, and also, of course, McGill and all the other sponsors. I am very grateful for this opportunity. I think some of the things I'm going to say are going to sound very familiar, because by now we have been talking a lot about the same subjects related to the notions of transcreation. And also what Dini just said recently really resonated with one of the main elements that I'm interested in this kind of poetry, which is the kinetic element, and this kind of desire to, as she beautifully put it, vivify or bring to life poetry in a way that's almost transcendent. It's almost like an act of creation with almost religious overtones. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start. So over the decades, Augusto de Campos has transfigured his early concrete poems by deploying the newest media to dream up a poetry that, in his words, quote, longs for the future, unquote. Early poems that originated as static, two-dimensional works became increasingly three-dimensional, sonorous, and kinetic. In essence, they became what William Carlos Williams understood poems to be: little machines with words as gears, bearings, and pistons in motion. With technology, de Campos manipulates poetic time and space, actualizing a kineticism that was previously only possible through metaphor, optical illusions, and suggested movement. Motion becomes a key signifier in de Campos's poetry, providing words with expressive force and transmuting them into animated word objects. As words drift, appear, and disappear, whether on a computer screen or projected against various surfaces, the poem becomes a mechanism of sight, sound, and movement, a material assemblage the reader can experience in an embodied state. With each transcreation, de Campos's poems acquire new valence and retroactively imbue previous versions with an added affective and semantic charge. His early poems articulated concrete poetry's foundational dynamic principles and were the motors propelling a poetic sensibility that blurred generic and semiotic distinctions between symbolic and iconic systems of representation, between words and images. His later works mobilized the plastic and filmic nature of the digital and allowed the actualization of the metaphors of movement of the early period, endowing the poetic image with new visualization capabilities. De Campos's restless quest to integrate the various dimensions of poetry, image, sound, texture, movement, etc., is itself a metaphor of perpetual movement, which corroborates the existence of a dynamic principle in his poetry, a poetry that is perpetually in forward motion. Oops. Okay. Before I approach some specific poems to examine De Campos's interest in the kinetic, I will speak briefly about the origins of concrete poetry in 1950s Brazil. Inheritors of Oswald de Andrade's Anthropophagia movement and indebted to the German Bauhaus, the Russian constructivists, and the Dutch neoplasticists, the concrete poets were wholeheartedly committed to an aesthetic of minimalist ornamentation, simplified syntax, carefully arranged and unadorned fonts, and a mathematical disposition of space and time in art. The idea was to apply scientific rigor to poetry, eliminating some of its more subjective aspects. In a sense, the concrete poets adopted the same tenets that propelled the construction of Brazil's new futuristic capital, Brasilia. The poets shared with the architects a vision of design that reveled in the abstract, highly rational, functional, and sleek patterns applied to all kinds of constructions, whether buildings, machines, paintings, or poems. Concrete poets and painters were also eager to embrace a self-reflexive approach to art, turning to the study of form and material. Augusto de Campos and the rest of the Neuganders group experimented with various forms of constrained writing, grids, figure-ground relations, and applying planar and three-dimensional structure to their texts. They wanted to make static art begin to move. In an economically booming post-World War II Brazil, the fascination with kinetic art was perfectly aligned with the growth of the automobile industry and the rise of modern architecture as fomented by Juscelino Kubitschek's government. Everything was moving and moving fast. In their desire to transcend to dimensionality and to embrace the dynamic impulse, Augusto de Campos and the concrete poets explored formats that went beyond the book, creating posters, paintings, and sculptures. In the rest of my talk, I will perform a deep dive into two of de Campos's iconic poems, Tensão and Viva Bahia, to see how they expressed a kinetic impulse and how the poet transcreated these works into various innovative formats. I will begin with Tensão, Tension, a canonical de Campos poem from 1956. Tensão has been analyzed by critics like Charles Perron, Adam Shelfors, and others, and I don't want to rehash previous readings. However, I do want to foreground a few of the poem's elements in relation to movement. As the title suggests, the poem enacts a series of tensions: directional tension, tension between word, image, and sound, and tension between blank and occupied space. In physics, tension is the force that results along an axis as atoms are pulled apart in opposite directions. An object subjected to tensile forces may be static, but it could at any point snap back in the opposite direction, so that the potential for kineticism is always present. This poem also appears to be barely containing an explosion of movement. Tensão is organized following a 3x3 reticular pattern of morpheme pairs for a total of 7 pairs located around the central one that keeps them all in tension. Maintaining this pattern, each morpheme contains 3 letters. Reading need not follow a left to right or up to down arrangement. Each word has a specific meaning, but also means in relation to its companion morpheme and to the other morpheme pairs, with endless combinations possible. Moreover, the sound and the visual arrangement of the morphemes are as significant in carrying meaning as their semantic content. Some sounds are repeated for their acoustic resonance, for example, the T, the C, the S. The play of signification also relies on slight differences and slippage between otherwise similar words and sounds. The poem partially abandons traditional temporality and spatiality to create a visual and sonorous syntax through the distribution of script on the plane of the page. It is meant to be understood simultaneously in all directions, spatially. That said, although concrete poetry emphasizes the spatial over the sequential, this poem still shows remnants of a left to right and top to bottom orientation. Reading the morpheme pairs from left to right, the poem loosely translates as with sound, they sing, they contain tension also, tone well, without sound. So the poem suggests that there is a tension between the visual and the oral dimension of the poem, since the visual arrangement emphasizes an alignment in the disposition of letters, in the meaning of the words, and in their sounds. Perron points to the general sense of the left to right reading as following a narrative, summarized as, quote, presence of sound, transition toward loss, absence of sound, unquote. Of course, a reading in another direction could yield a very different interpretation, keeping the semantic valence of the poem in a state of unresolved tension. The poem is also highly self-referential, as the subject is the words themselves, words which are rife with meaning, but are also meant to be heard, seen, and to a degree felt. The poem illustrates the definition of concrete poetry as tension of thin words in space-time, that is found in the Campos's pilot plan. They are both things and words, and they can signify in space visually or in time sequentially as they are spoken or read. But they're, at any rate, they are not static. I am interested here in the Campos's concept of dynamic structure as it applies to this poem. He defines the poem's dynamic structure as made up of a, quote, multiplicity of concomitant movements, unquote. One kind of kineticism has to do with the act of reading itself. The inherent multi-directionality of Tensao invites the reader to engage in ocular displacements closer to the observation of a painting than to the traditional left to right reading of a printed text. Movements that slow down and come to a halt as they focus on a particular morpheme in order to read it in the conventional lexical sense. The poem itself seems to be laid out like two interlocking squares that intersect at the Tensao pair, so that this disposition illustrates graphically a state of tension or of pulling apart, but also of bonding, staying together. Still, the eye does not remain fixated on the center. It would be a fascinating exercise to use an eye tracker to map out the displacements of the eye when reading or viewing this poem, since there is a tension between the act of reading and the act of looking. Perron actually mapped out the relations between sounds and images, what he calls the phono-visual web of the poem, which turns out to be a mesh of lines that bring out the poem's internal cube-like structure. Jessica Becker has considered the way the eye itself might move when reading it and suggests that plotting all the possible combinations results in a tesseract, a four-dimensional cube. These geometrical webs of connections, whether they are based on sound, on how the word looks, or on its meaning, lead to a reading practice that goes well beyond linear, beyond even 2 or 3-dimensional space. Evidently, the poem transmits its playful metapoetic message through the deconstruction and reorganization of its phonetic and semantic structure, forever combining and recombining. A second type of kineticism suggested by the poem relies on optical illusions. As Klaus Kluwer argued, the poem activates the analogical print kinetics of appearing and disappearing words by relying on illusionistic mechanisms and gestalt effects evocative of modernist paintings that also simulate movement. Kenneth David Jackson has also argued that in de Campos's poems, the word object, quote, is seen successively and simultaneously as sign, voice, matter, space, and form. Trompe l'oeil produces a tension among the ways of seeing which, while fixed on the object, oscillate in their choice of reading between meaning and matter or between movement and duration, unquote. This extremely dynamic multivalence in ways of seeing, reading, and interpreting the poem maintains a constant tension for the reader, viewer, listener who is experiencing it. Verbivoco-visual poems, such as this one, engage on at least 3 lexical registers: the semantic, the phonetic, and the visual, imitating movement through typographic mechanisms, shifting and displacing the coordinates of morphemes and phonemes within the space of the poem. Augusto de Campos' Tensao is representative of the first phase of concrete poetry, known as orthodox or heroic concretism, a period defined by the rigorous mathematical arrangement of the poetic elements, in this case, 3-letter morphemes. Tensao arranges a Cartesian space where controlled movements are made through deliberately planned patterns of repetition and variation. Echoing the geometrical exactitude of concrete painting, the meticulous linearity of Tensao's 3 perfectly aligned rows and columns, as well as diagonals, with their 3-letter morpheme pairs, suggests the illusion that words are flickering on and off, appearing and disappearing from view. To reveal its message, Tensao relies on a visual trick that plays with the tension between the blank spaces and the scripted space, similar to the relation between figure and ground or dark and light in optical art, resulting in the subjective perception that the static words alternate kinetically. By using simple verbal and visual patterns in regular and repetitive sequences, Tensao stimulates an illusion of movement. In 1996, De Campos reinvented Tensao as a multimedia performance for the exhibition Poesia e Risco, Poetry as Risk. In this transcreation, the words were animated by video artist Walter Silveira and set to the electric guitar music composed by Augusto's son, Cid Campos. Augusto reads the poem with a mix of recitation and song. Fragments from the poem are projected on a video screen in sync with the rhythm of the music and the poet's voice. According to the artist's statement, the intent was to materialize the other version of the poem in order to, quote, explore the dramatic potential of words and create an intimate relationship between poetry, music, and video, and in the process reimagine the traditional poetry reading with the help of new technologies, end quote. By adding voice and electronic music, sound becomes paramount in this graphophonetic poem. But movement also gains prominence in this version. In this version, the movement of the poem's morphemes shown in the projected video and the movement of the performers. The video is quite dynamic as the projected morphemes rapidly change their on-screen location and the background color also changes. The morpheme pairs flicker, shift and move, appear and disappear, and superimpose on each other.
Tensão com som, cantem, contém, também, tombem, sem som. Tensão com som, cantem, contém, também, tombem, sem som. Contém, contém, também, tombem, tensão, sem som, cantem, com som, tombem, sem som, com som, cantem, sem som, tombem, tensão, contém, também, sem som, contém, com som, cantem, sem som, tensão, contém, sem som, tombem, também, tensão, com som, cantem, contém, também, tombem, sem som.
As De Campos recites his poem, its projection on screen becomes an echo or a memory of its original paper version. The experience is profoundly intermedial, as the video recaptures the original script-based materiality. If the intersection of visual, verbal, and sound elements was already present in the paper poem, now these signs gain an added corporeality as they finally peel off the static page and begin to shimmer and shift. Similarly, the sound once trapped as a potential in the paper poem becomes truly audible, also embodied in de Campos's voice and through his son's music. But there is an added component, which is the live audience. The poet and the poem, as well as the audience, coexist as a joint physical presence in the live performance that brings art and life closer together and creates a sense of shared moment. For those of us who are not there, we have a deferred and somewhat diminished experience by seeing the performance on a DVD or on YouTube, but still one which can be described as multimediatic. In the live performance, de Campos reinforces the materiality of script by projecting text onto the screen and onto his own body. As he recites or sings his poem, the poet uses his voice to further materialize language for the audience. Again, here movement is key, the movement of lips, tongue, vocal cords, the vibration of air, and the gestures of the poet. Fragments from the poem are projected relentlessly on the screen and on the poet's body at varying speeds and frequency, creating visual rhythms. At times, these rhythms follow the cadence and match the words the poet recites. At times, they are projected so fast that they cannot be read in their totality, becoming pure visuality, image. The sensation is that of a collage or filmic montage as words intersect the moving body of the performer and the screen. The omnipresence of script confers on the performance a fleeting but intense presence as linguistic signs are relayed through different channels and signification codes, scriptural, verbal, iconic, phonetic, gestural. Movement, change, and speed are key to the vortex of words. Enunciation is not limited to the body, although that is where its origin and reception are located. Finally, all those floating morphemes and phonemes that are seen and heard in the real space of the performing venue dematerialize and enter the virtual world of zeros and ones. As I mentioned, most readers, spectators of this work are not there with de Campos, but consume the images through digital media, and thus the poetry is reconstituted in the delocalized, decenter, rhizomatic, and nomadic space of the internet. The contemporary spectator, already used to fragmented visuality, anneals and processes the phonetic and kinetic components of the poem to create a unity, albeit an unstable, flexible, mobile one that participates in the regime of the figural. For Jean-Francois Lyotard, the figural defines a semiotic regime where the distinction between linguistic and plastic representation disintegrates. This version of Tensao illustrates that script always contains figures or images. It is not reducible to pure meaning. The complex relations of text, image, and sound, linguistic self-reflexivity, and the kineticism generated by de Campos's performance stem directly from the earlier poem. All these effects were already contained within it. The later version of Tensao and other transcreations of early poems incorporate both analog and digital media into a hybrid format that explores the limits of contemporary poetry and language in order to bring that poetry to life. In that sense, de Campos is true to his words when he asserts, quote, "The concrete poet does not turn away from words. He does not glance at them obliquely. He goes directly to their center in order to live and vivify their facticity," unquote. I would like to examine a second poem that has also been through several iterations, incarnations, from paper to other formats, and in each case, the kinetic element has become more prominent. The well-known 1973 poem is called Viva Vaya, which loosely translates as hooray hissing. De Campos describes it as, quote, "an emblem of the confrontation between the artist and the public," unquote, as audience reception quickly turns from positive to negative, from vivas to vayas. The poem was inspired by a real event, the booing against Cayetano Veloso during a 1968 performance by a hostile audience in Rio. De Campos had at times experienced a similar sense of public rejection. Viva Vaya first appeared in the magazine Navi Loca in 1973, published next to a photo of Veloso holding the object poem. The geometric relationship between the words Viva and Vaya was based on the triangle and inspired by the pyramids that De Campos saw in Teotihuacan. The visual similarity between the two words conveys the close linkage between public adoration and rejection. The psychedelic design and vibrant color of the piece is also a celebration of tropicalismo, making reference to lyrics from Veloso's 1968 song Tropicalia, echoing verses such as Viva Bahia and Viva Maria. Artistic innovation for De Campos entails risk, with potential outcomes of acceptance, vivas, or of rejection, vayas. The deceptively simple geometric composition relies on 6 identical triangles and 2 vertical rectangles. The 2 words use these same basic shapes, but configure them differently as a comment on the similarities, but also the difference between acceptance and rejection as 2 sides of the same coin. The arrangement of the red and white letters creates a parallelogram that is almost perfectly symmetrical about the eye, and in which the upper word is the mirror image of the lower one. The only difference is based on the triangle shape placed at the upper left and lower right, respectively. There is, however, an inherent kineticism in the composition, as if the letters were about to revolve around that y-axis conformed by the letter I, and then the x-axis separating the words. Indeed, those 2 combined movements represent the potential for the kinetic reversal of public opinion from Viva to Vaya and vice versa. As the photo of Veloso holding the poem indicates, there is already an intent to think of the piece as an object that can be manipulated, moved, reorganized. This idea of the object poem that is captured, that is capable of movement, is further materialized in the 1974 version of Viva Vaya found in the book Poemobiles, created by De Campos and the visual artist Julio Plata, as we saw earlier. The title of the book Poemobiles defines the collection as poems that move like mobiles, sculptures that rely on equilibrium, and can also be found in children's scribs. In the Poemobiles book, the reading process involves childlike play, manipulating the different folds and cuts of the pop-up poems, similar to the art of origami, as poems gain 3-dimensionality, or arguably 4-dimensionality if we consider time, the time of reading, the time of unfolding and playing with a poem. For De Campos, this playful collection defined an intermediate modality between the book and sculpture. In this version, the interplay between Viva and Vaya takes place both at the surface of the page, or the planar level, and at the 3D raised paper fold. The poem maintains the elegance of the triangular structures, now even more directly evoking the pyramid shape that inspired it. The reader is actively involved in opening and moving these folding structures and revealing the mechanism and meanings of the poem, so that movement becomes the key for poetic revelation. The 3-dimensionality of the poem becomes even more prominent in a large sculpture created for the Rêver exhibition in 2016. The 2 words are placed in opposite faces of a triangular prism, making it necessary for the spectator to walk around the entire poem to understand the relationship between the forms and the wordplay. And in 2016, Brazilian poet, graphic designer, and translator André Valias, who I believe is actually watching today, created an animated version of the poem reminiscent in style to De Campos's own online clip poemas. Bringing the kinetic impulse to the fore, the letters are animated and rotate from the Viva to the Vaya position. In the case of the first V and the A, that is the 2-edged triangles, they rotate 180 degrees back into their original position, while the middle IV rotates through both the X and the Y axis in order to change into the AI. Valias's poem goes through 2 iterations of this transformation, from Viva to Vaya and back to Viva, ending on a positive note. Both the added sound and the movement reinforce the semantic content, demonstrating the ease with which an adoring public turns on a creator, but also how the initial rejection of innovative art eventually finds its acceptance. While this turning of one set of letters into another was always already present in de Campos's original work, here it materialized as an actual rotation. Perhaps something is lost by rendering the operation so materially obvious. Does it preclude a different way of reading the poem? Perhaps. At the same time, Vallesa's version elegantly emphasizes the isomorphic relationship between the shape of the word, its meaning, and the sound that accompanies it. In that sense, the kineticism here is closely allied to the political intent of the piece as a defense of artistic freedom and innovation. Granted, it is at times difficult to glean political readings from such playfully ambiguous, concrete poetry, and possibly the ambiguity is itself also the point. Oops. Oh. For de Campos, it is the kinetic impulse that drives his transcreations of these poems toward greater mobility, facilitated by developments in media technology. As he stated, quote, "The virtual movement of the printed word, the typogram, is giving way to the real movement of the computerized word, the videogram, and to the typography of the electronic era. Today's cinematic poetry, when combined with computerized sound resources, can raise the verbivoco-visual structures preconceived by concrete poetry to their most complete materialization," end quote. I outlined some of the continuities between early concrete poetry and later transcreations of the same works into different media, with a focus on the impulse to add motion to otherwise static works. The concrete poets attempted to replace analogies of motion with real structural movement, and were at least partially successful. The way text moved or appeared to move, or the way it related visually or orally, mattered as much as what it said, or rather the way it moved was key to its message. Insofar as Tansao and Viva Vaya comment on their own poetic structure and on the relationship between referential and non-referential elements, they become a commentary on poetry and indeed on language itself. De Campos's foregrounds the material substance of the poem, its visual structure, the chosen font, its disposition. In his 1933 text, What is Poetry?, Roman Jakobson, writing about the materiality of poetry, said, quote, "Poetry is present when a word is felt as a word and not as a mere representation of the object being named or an outburst of emotion. When words and their composition, their meaning, their external and internal form acquire a weight and value of their own instead of referring indifferently to reality," unquote. Thus, words are felt, they have a physical presence, but Jakobson also reminds us about their affectivity, their feeling. Augusto de Campos's work would seem to exemplify Jakobson's passage as an especially material poetry, a poetry that moves in every sense of that word, a kinetic poetry. Obrigado.
Okay, thank you so much, Eduardo. I'll go ahead and jump in to moderate the Q&A. That was a absolutely fascinating, very detailed and very meticulous reading of these poems. And I think we've all, you'll see in the chat, thought that this was just an incredible contribution to not only the conference, but also largely to our exploration of digital literature, digital poetry, contemporary Brazilian cultural production, and many, many more things. So wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Eduardo. I'm going to go ahead and turn to the chat after asking a question of my own. And I'd like to actually start out by thinking a little bit more about sort of the connection between the physical sort of material poems and then sort of the transition into the digital space. You said it is the kinetic impulse that drives Augusto de Campos' transcreation of his works into the digital space. The way texts move or appeared to move mattered as much as what they said, right? So I thought that was a really wonderful way of sort of concluding your talk. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about possibilities of transcreation of his work as we move forward. Obviously, Eduardo is in his later years, and we're curious to see how things will develop with his work by other authors. I love the inclusion of other artists, etc. But I'm wondering if you could kind of maybe look into the future and see how this will develop across, let's say, the next 10 years.
That's a really interesting question. So I think one potential area that I have not seen a lot of transcreation, but I have a sense that it's almost like the next step would be moving on to the virtual reality environment, right? I mean, we've seen some of that already with cave poetry back in the day when caves were sort of the thing in universities, and then eventually they started to disappear. But sort of moving to that, both virtual reality and augmented reality. So what can we do with poetry in those spaces to get people excited about poetry, but also about the digital afterlife of poetic works that I think can still offer a lot. And I think any of these poems could be revisited in an augmented reality environment that would give somebody with a headset or some other kind of equipment, the gloves, et cetera, a way to manipulate these poems in ways that go beyond what you can do with an object poem, right? I haven't really thought about what some of those things could be, but one can certainly begin to envision ways in which those poems can now be geolocated in certain ways, right? In which cell phones can become a part of the experiment. How do we do some of the things that were being done already with geolocated narratives, but with poetry, so that you can have an experience of a De Campos poem that's anchored in a particular space, in a particular city. So, I mean, these are just some of the ideas, but I think there is definitely a lot of potential for experimentation there.
Thank you so much. I actually have a question on the historical aspect with regard to the later political development that you showed, but I would rather not. I want to kind of focus on horizontal knowledge exchange. So I'm going to turn to the audience first. If we have time for my question, I'll turn to that in a second. But would someone like to ask a live question of Eduardo, or else I'll go to my second question. Okay, in that case, I will go ahead and ask you a second question. So I loved the sort of the historical context you gave in the beginning, the talk about modernist architecture, the sort of placing this within the 1950s and 60s in Brazil. And then later you sort of took up the kind of question of politics later on. I guess, but you also made an interesting nuance to that argument and said that play and ambiguity are essential to this type of writing and this type of poetry. I'm wondering if there are lessons that can be learned in terms of the sort of connection between artistic production and political change that we can take from these concrete poets, and if how can we use concepts like play or concepts like sort of thinking through kinetic movement as a type of play, and sort of extend those beyond this particular body of work.
Okay, let me tackle the first one, and then hopefully I'll remember the second one. So I mean, obviously the question about politics was there at the beginning, right? And that's what causes that schism between the Sao Paulo-based concrete poets and the people like Ferreira Goulart and the neo-concretists. And so, I think this is something that I kind of wrestled with in my book was, there's this tendency to want to kind of sometimes force a political reading on some of these early concrete works that maybe is not really necessary, in the sense that there's a politics of form there, or there's a politics of the work of art that has to do with pushing against the boundaries of the text, pushing against media, and trying to really revel also in the autonomy of the work of art, right? And that in itself is kind of a political act, even if it doesn't speak necessarily to the politics of the moment or the more maybe pressing political questions of the moment. So there's that. I mean, and I think that's a valid critique against early concretism, which obviously later works by De Campos, like we saw, the Omito work is very, very much anchored in the politics of today, and Bolsonaro kind of deal more directly with the question of politics. But I don't feel like the artist is necessarily obligated to tackle issues of political relevance so directly or perforce, right? I guess that's, you know, that's a big question to address, but you know, I'm more interested in the case of De Campos's work and the way he's making language do things that are in itself radical than necessarily tackling radical politics. As far as I'm forgetting, what was the second question about the kinetic?
Oh, right. So just the kinetic as a form of play, right? So it's a form of kind of playing with readers.
Yeah.
And then the power of play as a political act. I guess that was the last part of it.
Sure, right. Okay, yeah. So that's definitely part of the avant-gardes from the very beginning, right? I mean, the obsession with movement and with play. I mean, we see it, of course, with everything from Duchamp's, you know, Nude Descending the Staircase to there's this desire to capture movement, to break the two-dimensionality of the page or the painting. That is in a way a play with form and with media, right? It's a way to transcend that is in some sense political, right? In the sense that you know, you're breaking with tradition, you're breaking with expectation, with artistic norm. And that, I think, can be related to some of the experiments that new media has engaged in the recent past. So I don't know if I really answered that, but
yeah, that was beautiful. Thank you so much for such an elegant answer and elegant thought on you know, the power of the kinetic. There is a delightful question from Bonac Ferran, but it looks like we're kind of running out of time. So we'll send you the chat, Eduardo, and then that'll give you the ability to reach out to folks directly about questions, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and thank Eduardo one final time. I'll turn on my reaction emoji. And in fact, we are now going to be turning to our virtual exhibition. So I will turn the mic over to my colleagues. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and turn to that. Thank you again, Eduardo. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, and thanks, Cecily, for the beautiful moderation of Q&A.